If you listen even for a moment to the government, the number one mission is to maximise economic growth. Economic growth is what's going to produce more money, and that's what's going to support public expenditure on public services. Makes sense, doesn't it? Well, yes, but then we have to look at the choices that the government is making and the arguments that are purport to support this idea. Basically, the government assumes that the sprint, and it's not just a dash, it's a sprint to net zero electricity by 2030, plus lots and lots of new houses, equal economic growth. I'll put the houses issue aside, though there are important issues and challenges in achieving that objective, and turn to the energy side. So the story that we're told is that we're going to invest in all these shiny new wind farms, solar panels, and new transmission and distribution lines. And all this investment is going to lead to lower electricity bills. Costs are going to come down and investment's going to go up. And, what's not to like about that? Well, in fact, quite a lot. So let's start off with where we are on the cost of energy and how that impacts upon competitiveness and economic growth. You would have thought that claiming to be world leaders in addressing climate change and the dash to net zero, the sprint, that the UK would by now start to see the benefits of having so much offshore wind and indeed so much renewables as to be one of the leading countries in the world in developing renewables. You might think that industry was flocking to the UK to get close to that much cheaper renewable energy. And for the current Secretary of State, this is going to be 10 times cheaper than fossil fuels. So you might think in Trump's America, he's about to face an enormous competitive shock because he's backing fossil fuels. And if fossil fuels are going to be so much more expensive than renewables, surely American energy-intensive industries will be reaching for the exit and dashing to get to the UK to locate here, again, for that much cheaper renewables as opposed to that much more expensive oil and gas and indeed coal in the United States. Of course, it's nonsense. Actually, exactly the opposite's happening. The United States is attracting energy-intensive industries across the piece. And why? Well, because it has gas costs, which are 3 or 4 times cheaper than in the UK and in Europe. It has abundant oil. It's now the largest oil producer in the world. So taking oil and gas together, effectively it's self-sufficient and has all the security that goes with that. And on top of that, unlike the UK, it has lots and lots of onshore locations where renewables probably are quite cheap. The inconvenient fact, is that the UK has amongst the highest industrial energy costs in the developed world. You have to pause and let that sink in. And in addition, it has amongst the highest retail consumer prices in Europe and indeed more generally around the world. We have not cheaper energy as a response to 15 years of developing renewables. We have really expensive energy. Indeed, it's so expensive that rather than energy-intensive companies flocking to get to the UK, actually the opposite is happening. So the closure of Port Talbot at Steelworks is all about energy costs and the replacement with eventually an electric energy-sourced refurbishment of scrap metal is hardly a replacement for primary steel, which an economy like the UK is going to need. And not just for its industry and its pylons and its steel that goes into all those wind farms, but in addition for defence, for tanks, for submarines, for all sorts of stuff, which is the fabric of a major economy. And then there's Grangemouth in Scotland, huge petrochemical plant. What's it going to do? Close and be a centre for importing refined product into the UK and a few other things too. So when we look across the piece, it's no wonder that the emissions, the territorial emissions in the UK are falling in a world where we have basically gone about deindustrialising for 40 years and we're in, I would argue, the final throes of doing that. You might say, yes, but we may be deindustrialising, but we're going to have all those shiny new data centres to support the industrial strategy for AI. Well, here again, we have to look carefully at the facts as opposed to the convenient fictions. If you run a data centre, it's amazingly energy intensive. You need electricity 24/7, every 24 and every 7. It's no good saying, well, in winter it's going to be a bit tight, and if Northern Europe has a high pressure, cold, cloudy weather system in winter, well, it's going to get very much close to the margin, and we're going to have to rely on all those interconnectors bringing energy from Europe, and also what I would call voluntary power cuts, so-called active demand, to make supply equal demand. Not obviously great in a world where security of supply is more and more and more important in a more and more digital world going forward. So we have to look quite carefully at whether what we're doing is actually contributing to reducing global warming, or whether, in fact, it isn't, and indeed whether some of the things we're doing have perverse consequences, like buying the steel from China instead of producing it at Port Talbot, as just one particular case. So why is it the case that the two countries in Europe which have gone fastest in terms of the dash for renewables, Germany and the UK, end up with high prices, not low prices? The Energiewende in Germany has been arguably more damaging to Germany than our policy has been to the UK, but that's partly because Germany decided, understandably, to close its existing nuclear power stations, build some new coal, and of course it has a serious manufacturing sector which requires energy-intensive production. But neither the Energiewende in Germany nor the UK dash for offshore wind in particular have produced good outcomes in terms of competitiveness. Now, the reasons are pretty straightforward. Wind, for example, and solar, but particularly wind, is intermittent. It's decentralised. And if you want to have a secure energy supply system and you have intermittent power, then what you need is a lot more capacity than you otherwise would have had. Many more gigawatts of capacity have to sit on the system just in case the wind doesn't blow very much, as, for example, happened in November last year and happened earlier this year too. So you have to have a lot more kit on the system, and that kit doesn't come cheap. We will, according to the NESO report, by 2030 be relying on 35 gigawatts of gas, which is only going to be used 5% of the time. These are all costs of net zero. You need a much more developed transmission system for decentralised intermittent wind and solar. That's going to cost. And similarly, we need a lot more on the distribution side. That's going to cost. Already, levies, what I would call subsidies in our energy bills, are about 25% of the total for consumers. Now, this isn't just, nice analytics, sort of neat little intellectual points. This is really serious because not only does it undermine the growth mission, driving up the energy prices does not seem to me to be a good way of maximising competitiveness, particularly against the United States and China. It's true for much of Europe too, but it's worse here. It's not only that particular problem, but it's the additional problem of trying to work out why there's going to be a consensus around the pursuit of net zero itself. What the government has done, and it seems to me to be a deliberate policy, is to try to use net zero as a wedge between Labour and Conservatives and Labour and everybody else, apart from perhaps the Liberal Democrats. It's been deliberately designed to be divisive, to divide lines. That's what the spin is all about. Well, that's really bad news for investors. And remember, most of these investors are overseas. And it's really bad news for the continuity of climate change policy in the UK. Energy and climate policy is long term. If you decide, we'll set ourselves a deadline of 2030 for net zero electricity. Why? Well, because the Conservatives had 2035 as the target, might be part of the answer. But let's say you decide to do that. Well, you make a decision. You effectively decide, since it is a sprint, it's 60 months to do this, you have to pay whatever it costs to achieve the target. You want a new transformer to do parts of your grid? Well, there's a waiting list. 3 years, maybe 4 years. No, I want it right now because I've got to meet my target in 2030. Well, if you really want to pay absolutely top price and buy out others in the order queue, I'm sure it could be done. But don't think it's going to be cheap. One of the worst things you can do in energy policy is set a completely unrealistic target, sprint towards it, and then imagine that you're going to have low-cost energy at the end. And remember, this government promised before the election that the consumers would have 300 quid off their bills. Well, unless there's a really sharp fall in gas prices, it's going to have to be that the government takes that 25% of bills back onto the taxpayers. That's not a saving overall, that's a switching of who pays from one group to another. So if you want to do a dash to a particular target, then you will have to pay whatever it costs. And of course, we may end up with the worst of all possible worlds. Good intentions may pave the road to hell. And what is that outcome? Well, you fracture the net zero consensus further. You push the Conservatives and Reform into an anti-net zero position. Think what investors are going to make of that. You turn the public against you because they can't afford the bills that you're forcing upon them. And then industry looks at the outlook, and if its two major costs are energy and labour, if the government's growth policy is combined with forcing up the cost of labour to employers significantly, and at the same time, by the sprint to net zero, forcing up the cost of energy to companies. If you put those two things together, how exactly one imagines that there's going to be a renaissance in growth in the UK? And to take it further, if you say, we're going to have lots and lots of AI, data centers, etc., this is the new industry of the future, which may well be true, then you should recognize at the same time that one of the core inputs to this new industry of the future is going to be competitively priced energy that's genuinely secure. And it's not just industry that wants secure supplies. In a world where we're always online, where there's Spotify and there's Netflix and all the other things that now take up our time, in that world, do people really want to have voluntary power cuts? Do they really want to try to get lower bills by offering to be interrupted in their supplies? Not a bit of it. Everyone's going in a different direction. This is a new world driven by digital technologies. Energy is now much more important. It's a much bigger proportion of costs, and increasingly, its security is the key issue. It must be affordable, but it must be secure. Our energy policy points in a very different direction. And the really sad thing about all this is that it would be fine if the result was that we were going to actually make a bigger difference to global warming. Running down rapidly our territorial carbon production is not the same as reducing our carbon consumption to net zero. That would be altogether a more serious objective to pursue and much more challenging. Thank you.